introduce the webinar today and what we're going to be discussing. And then Jim and I are going to have a conversation about why this is important in the sales space and for organisations who use that kind of business development. But to kick us off, I'm going to pass back to Jim, who's going to introduce the model and where his kind of love for the research came from.
Great, thank you. So yes, partly born out of interest from clients who were asking me to comment on individuals' commercial skills and as I said, ability to grow a business or build a practice area. And based on the leadership assessments I've been doing up until that point, I found it quite difficult to comment on the sort of commercial side because a lot of the leadership models were very much geared towards people leadership. So I was interested in sort of applying that similar methodology, but looking at commercial behaviors, and that led to the creation of the acuity model, the graphic that you can see here. We do have a white paper, which I'm very happy to share with anyone who is interested in the underlying research. But just to talk you through the model for now, what we found is that it splits quite nicely, and this wasn't deliberate, but it splits quite nicely into three broad dimensions, which you can see by those different coloured triangles in the graphic. So we look at personal drive, so why someone sells or undertakes commercial activity. That looks at and measures an individual's motivation to get out and undertake sales activities. It looks at someone's goal focus, so the clarity of their goals, their understanding of what they're trying to achieve when they are selling or undertaking commercial activity, and the extent to which they'll break those goals down into specific actions and activities to help them achieve that outcome. And the third element there is self-belief, which is about someone's optimism and positivity in terms of being able to achieve success, but also resilience when things are not going so well as well. So really what that looks at is someone's consistency of behavior. The second dimension, bottom right there, is sales focus. That looks at more of sort of what an individual needs to do. So there are three elements to that, as you can see. One is gathering knowledge. So that's about really understanding your client and the sector or segment in which they operate so that you understand their world and perhaps some of their pain points. The second element is educates the client, which is using your expertise and insight combined with what you know about the client's world to position yourself as a trusted advisor. And then the third element there is drives the sale, which is all about creating momentum in the sales cycle rather than being a sort of passive passenger within the cycle. And then the third dimension at the top looks at how an individual sells. That's more about the sort of interpersonal interactions. So perspective taking is reading the audience, reading the room, reading the individual that you're having a conversation with, to really understand their needs, wants, and drivers. Interpersonal style is then how you may flex your behavior to get the best out of each conversation. And then connectedness is about the network. Now, that could be internally within your own organization to bring all the best parts of your organization to bear on the customer. And it can also be about your external network either into that particular customer, so understanding who are all the stakeholders and influencers within a particular customer, or it could be broader if you are a hunter, let's say, in the traditional sales term. It could be about your sort of sector network if you're targeting a particular sector. So those are the broad behaviors that we found really make a difference, really impact on sales performance in a complex B2B sales environment.
Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting perspective of looking at sales because most organizations will think about sales performance from a skills perspective, from a technical perspective in terms of reaching targets and how that you can assess an effective salesperson in that direction. But what you're looking at is where the behavioural challenge lies rather than the skills challenge. What do you kind of specifically mean by the behavioural challenge rather than a skills challenge.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting because in the world of leadership development, which is my background, the focus is very much on the behavior of a leader. Now, when you
Mm.
talk to sales organizations and sales leaders, that's not a language that they typically use, and actually they're far more interested in, the process or whether sellers are following a particular methodology. Sales training is often geared around process and methodology as well. So introducing the language of behavior and looking at what are the behaviors that drive success is actually quite a new lens for sales organizations to think about when they think about sales and business development.
And I think that's so true because if you think of kind of the regular or more stereotypical organizational structure, there's so much value and effort put into kind of leadership training, especially nowadays, and it comes from that kind of behavioral level. But there's not necessarily that for the unique departments or teams within that, and particularly sales professionals. So I think that's a really key way of looking at a different side of performance. And obviously, all the individuals in this call will know how important behaviour is in the workplace and where it can have that impact. I guess my next question is then, can people actually develop these behaviours? Is it something that we can do, or is it going to be more stable, like personality or things like that?
Yeah, okay, great question. So, yes, these things can be developed. I probably, if I look at myself, I've definitely developed in these areas, having sort of identified that these are behaviors that support success in sales. So, my first role was actually a sales role with SHL,
Okay.
psychometric test publisher. And if I look at these behaviors in the model, I had very few of these at the start of my career. Now, I've developed my expertise over 20 odd years of working in this field. But I think that the key thing that I found is the personal drive factors, being really clear about what you're trying to achieve, being really clear about what those activities are that are going to help you to get success, and actually being resilient and consistent in the way that you execute on those. I think a lot of people who are, let's say, technical experts who have to go and sell to clients, the likes of you and I, and probably many people on this call, when we're busy with the delivery elements, which we probably enjoy more, the sort of BD and sales activity falls off a cliff a bit. So you get this quite sort of spiky profile of business development activity. And that can be demotivating because you're not generating the success that you would like to be. Um, so what I found is that those personal drive factors can be really key.
Yeah, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there in why this tool is so interesting to me anyway, because everything you've described isn't exclusive to people who are working in sales. And
Mm.
I'm not a sales professional. I haven't had strict training on being a salesperson. However, it's a massive part of my role, especially in my new role, in talking to clients and establishing rapport. And as I say, I'm far more comfortable in that delivery side when I'm talking about my expertise in a topic, and that's where I'm comfortable. But having a selling conversation, I find really tricky. But you've just kind of explained how this model isn't just for those sales individuals, but you can use those behaviors for any person who is in that space and who is trying to connect with clients and build that business. And for people like me who aren't sellers at all and find it quite uncomfortable, what would be your key takeaway from this and in advice, I guess, in helping me be better?
Yeah, I think interesting the language that you've used there. I mean, comfort is definitely an issue for people when it comes to selling, and we talk a lot about um, discomfort when we talk about this model. In terms of answering your question, so what could you kind of really do differently? I think it's about being really intentional and really deliberate. So, for example, um, we profile people a lot using this model, and when we compare the results from their acuity profiles to other let's say personality assessments, there can be some real divergence. So, for example, when coaching people using this tool, we've profiled individuals who come out very low on goal focus. So that what they're not doing is sort of setting themselves clear goals or planning their activities out. Yet on a personality profile, they would score high on planning and organizing, for example, just pointing out that dichotomy. So actually, what you're doing is sort of existing in this state of, if I do a bit of activity, hopefully some success will come, but there's no clear kind of plan around how to deliver that. So that's where I come back to that being intentional. If you were to apply those same planning skills that you may use for other parts of your role, so when you're undertaking delivery, for example, and actually built that into a clear plan for business development, um, and held yourself obviously to account for that plan, then you would probably start to see some much more consistent success in your business development.
Yeah, and I think those kind of conversations I have so often with clients doing feedback, even on different behavior measures, where I'll be looking at the difference between their behaviors and the personality, and they go, but I am like this. Why have I come out in this way? And it's because of they're not intentionally using that drive that they have internally to work with that behavior, I guess, and to work with that situation. I mean, even for myself, I'd probably say I'm naturally a bit of an ambivert in how I flex to people. But when it comes to sales conversations, I find that tricky and I retreat into myself. I don't rely on my extrovert qualities. I almost kind of retreat, and maybe that's the intention of going, no, I can do this when I'm delivering. Why can't I do this in this conversation? And what's the difference? And how can I move through these different scenarios in a different way and using these behaviors intentionally? And I'm sure very familiar conversations across the individuals in this call as well, who I'm sure have coached people with similar situations.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the other things we find is that, for example, when we look at connectedness, you might find that people actually have some good networks into the sort of client space, but
Mm.
um, where they are maybe again coming back to the sort of discomfort overriding that behavior, um, they're maybe not using those networks to ask for, well, to make an ask of those networks. So asking for a referral, an introduction, a case study, a recommendation. People just feel uncomfortable doing it, even though they may have good relationships with people across their network.
Yeah, and I think that moves on to where organizations can actually make the difference and what they can do about it. Why doesn't that sales training work often in organizations? What are they missing and what can they do differently?
Yeah. So what I've found to date is that often the sales function is a bit of a closed shop to people in sort of our field, maybe. So they tend to commission their own training often. And going back to what we said earlier, it tends to be very much focused on either product knowledge or sales process or sales methodology. So they're looking at activity. How many calls have you made? How many meetings have you had? How many conversations have taken place? At what stage in the sales cycle are we at? Have you updated Salesforce or whatever the system might be? So the behaviors don't get addressed. And so when we've profiled organizations, often we can go back to them and say, okay, within this model, there's some of these things you do really well as an organization, but there are some gaps here where maybe some investments and developments and training would go a long way to sort of supporting greater success. So I think sales training needs to be rounded. It needs to include process and methodology factors, definitely, but that's not enough alone. And in terms of the behavioral side, you need to have the right people in the room in the first place, or at least have an intention to develop those behaviors if people need support. And so the best organizations are the ones that, don't treat the training as a sort of a one and done for the year, but they're using the data, the insights to support ongoing coaching and development of individuals.
And it's so interesting you say that because it's exactly what I'm doing currently. And so now I know I need to do other things because at the moment I've been introducing tracking out opportunities and looking at the kind of statistics, exactly what you said, looking at how long it takes people to close the deal and so on. But I haven't really been looking at who it is that's been doing that and how they've been doing it and where that behavior comes from. So maybe that's a personal note for me that I need to start looking at that as well. We have all of our acuity profiles as well, so maybe I could make use of that and intertwine that into our meetings as well.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Very happy to support if you need any.
Yes. So it's all very well and good in looking at what organizations can do, but obviously we know as consultants how difficult it is to actually get our foot in the door and in encouraging organizations to invest in this and to help HR kind of gain buy-in. What would you suggest and how do you kind of demonstrate that commercial value to gaining buy-in in this space?
Yeah, so speak the language of the commercial function. So we do a lot of validation studies with clients to show, just what impact these behaviors have on sales performance, and that obviously appeals to sales leaders. So in our most recent validation study with a technology business, there. Top third scorers on Acuity were generating or averaging 128% of revenue for the year, whereas the bottom third were generating an average 81% revenue for the year. So that's a clear, return on investment to be able to take to sales leaders and really show them the impact of these behaviors.
Yeah. And did you find that specific behaviors in this model contributed to more or less success in those different functions?
Uh, yes, we did. So there were a number of different teams within the organization, but at a sort of whole organization level, drives the sale was one of the leading sort of indicators. So that ability
Okay.
to create momentum in a sale and not be passive. So, again, coming back to discomfort, some people won't feel comfortable chasing clients and, finding out what may be stalling a deal or working out, who are the blockers to this sale moving forwards? Are there stakeholders that, maybe I'm not aware of, or influencers or decision makers that I need to circle back to? And so the best salespeople are really good at sustaining that momentum, and rather than thinking, oh well, maybe I'll give them another week before I call them back and find out what's going on.
And I think that is something that I struggle with a lot in that not wanting to be pushy and not wanting to come across as that kind of hard seller that is just trying to get their foot in the door rather than being client focused and creating that relationship. So I usually do tend on the cautious side of not pressuring and not pushing forward. And how do you kind of tread the line, I guess, between being pushy and then being just consistent and communicative?
Yeah, so there's probably a couple of elements that spring to mind there. One, I would always encourage people to be authentic. So don't try and be something you're not, and don't try and suddenly be super pushy if that's not you. But maybe think about what would being a little bit more intentional look like, or being a little bit more positive look like. So, if you typically wait 3 weeks before reconnecting with the client, what difference would it make to make that 2 weeks, for example? And actually, over a number of interactions, that's going to save a huge amount of time. On a practical level, one thing you can do is before you end a conversation with a client is get some commitment from them as to when you can
Mm,
contact them next. So,
yeah.
and put the ball in their court. So ask them, what do we need to do next? What does that look like? is there anyone else we need to involve? How soon shall we pick up this conversation to allow you to
Mm.
have whatever conversations you need to have internally? So, really trying to ascertain before one conversation finishes or one meeting finishes what those next steps are. So you've almost got their um, buy-in and agreement for that next stage of contact.
Yeah, and I must admit that the occasions that I have done that does work really well because otherwise you end that call, you send a follow-up email, and then it's really challenging to get that call again or to reach out again. But whereas the times where at the end of that meeting you do go, okay, so actually let's look at our calendars next week. Do you have time here? And we'll discuss X, Y, Z. And there's an agenda and it's planned and then it's in the calendar and they can't say no.
Yes, yeah, yeah. And I think the other thing is it's really easy to fall into emailing. So I
Mm,
always try to pick up the phone where I can. Um, it's so easy just to go, well, I'll send them a quick chaser email.
yeah.
Could get lost. They may not be ignoring you. It may just get lost in the deluge of emails that people get every day.
Yeah, and I think that is I don't know if it's a generational thing or what, but I hate talking on the phone as well, and I will always lean on the side of emailing over phone. But I completely agree that actually sometimes to get the conversation going is just to pick up that phone and have that conversation rather than that waiting, because then you're losing time, even if it's just because they're busy and not able to respond at that time, or it's moving down their priority list as well. So yeah, I can add that to our mission as well. So with all of that and the kind of trends that are going on within the workplace, we've spent a lot
Mm.
of the time talking about the human side of sales, but it is pretty much impossible to ignore how quickly AI is changing the way we work. And it's not a 2026 webinar without talking about artificial intelligence. And more, I'm noticing kind of websites being powered by AI chatbots, and they're your first point of contact to an organization, and there you're kind of selling um, uh, robot agent, whatever it might be, that is communicating with the client. And it's just becoming that kind of familiar customer experience. And I guess there's differences between how that's accepted. Sometimes it's quite useful because if you just have a couple of questions and that chatbot can immediately give it to you. Whereas if you're, ringing a company and you're answered by an AI chatbot and they're there to answer your queries, it almost takes away that human element of selling. Do you think that there is going to be a greater impact on the kind of world of sales with this introduction of AI and with this continuance reliance on artificial intelligence?
So, with the caveat that I'm by no means an AI expert, I think all the trends that I'm seeing in sales and the commentary is towards really just freeing up the human seller's time to really invest in the human side of sales, the relationship building,
Mm,
the meeting clients. So the biggest benefit that I can see is really reducing all of the admin burden, if you like, of updating, reporting functions and etc. And also that, as you've talked about, the sort of early stage of the sales funnel where you're getting general queries in through a website. I think as long as you've got a really good mechanism for then taking those queries and being able to sift those into what are genuine and worth pursuing, and you do that very quickly. So that transition from AI or chatbot across to the human, that could work really well. And if it means that sellers are able to be much more efficient and have much more time for those face-to-face interactions, then I think that's how it could work at its best. As you've mentioned, there are experiences where that gold standard isn't reached. But I think that's the real challenge for organizations, is really how to make that handoff as smooth
mm.
as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Because as I say, I think with all functions and even removing the sales element, AI is our kind of other employee in how it can help us with that admin element and the structures of things, even if it's researching companies and trying to find out information and organizing that kind of gathers knowledge element, but making sure that then you have time to actually do the more important things like the face-to-face things and so on. And it's the same with that kind of emotional intelligence aspect. You know, AI can do all sorts of things, but it's never going to tell you exactly how someone's feeling, because for AI to do that, it's got to actually recognize exactly how someone is feeling, other than you just inputting it because you might be wrong. And all of those things might be distorting the real picture and the human element of that, and therefore that connection and that human emotional side is where you get the most fruitful piece of information and behavior change, I think, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think AI can't yet, have that conversation, or as you say, interpret how someone might be thinking or feeling beyond what they're saying. Being able to read people's body language, for example, or pick up on the sort of nuances in how people might emphasize certain words or phrases. That's all stuff that we as humans can do very well, and that's where we need to focus our time as salespeople or kind of business development and commercial activity. Really, that's the that's the crucial thing that we can add, and we can add value to as well. I think that's the key thing really. And that's where we circle back to behavior. It's all about behavior at the end of the day.
Absolutely, and I appreciate we've spoken a lot about different things here, and I want to allow some time for our audience to
Mm.
ask any questions that they might have. But on a final note, if HR professionals, if organizations could do one change over the next 12 months, 6 months to improve that kind of sales capability, what is your recommendation as an expert in this?
Yeah, so I would say find people with that personal drive dimension who are really kind of genuinely motivated and interested in going out and undertaking sales activities, who are clear on what they're trying to achieve, and who really have that self-belief. So they're positive and optimistic about what they can influence, but they're also resilient when things don't go so well. Because if you've got that drive, then you can train those other areas much more easily than the other way round. So, people who are low on those drive areas, actually that's probably a deeper coaching conversation, a conversation about aspirations and career progression, and you might have people who are currently in client-facing roles who just don't enjoy it. And I've had coaching conversations with people who have said, "Look, I know I want the next promotion, but I'm not a salesperson. I don't, that's not a role that interests me." And that's okay. These people can add value to the organization in different ways, but I think it's all about um, getting the right players in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, it always stems from that recruitment element and the onboarding and then the existing employees that you have to develop those individuals as well. And it's a process, and it's not always going to be quick, and it's not always going to be immediate. But if we kind of invest in those small subsections, then you might see that kind of overall change in the end.
Mm.
But yeah,
Yeah, I
thank
mean,
you very much. Oh,
just
sorry,
sorry,
go
one
on.
other thing to add, I would say, if we're not recruiting for these behaviors and we're not developing these behaviors, then it's very difficult to expect people to demonstrate these behaviors on a consistent basis. So I would say, we need to be looking for these behaviors when we bring people into an organization, maybe at more junior levels, and then coach and support and develop them so that when they do need to rely on them, they're there and ready to go. And coming back to, you know, people in those sort of roles of technical expert, if I think about, lawyers, accountants, engineers, none of them expect to sell when they start their career, and none of these behaviors are being measured by the organizations that are recruiting them. And so that's why you end up with people then in senior levels in those types of organizations who, maybe don't perform when it comes to the commercial side.
Yeah, no, and I think that's so interesting. It's just triggered a thought in terms of it's almost that organization responsibility in those kind of job descriptions and person specification to outline that as well and to explore that right at that beginning. Because even if it isn't that main focal point of your role, as you say, kind of engineers and other specialisms aren't necessarily going in to be a sales person or to create that business. However, as I've mentioned, it's an important part of everyone's role. It's not just necessarily trying to sell outwardly, but even internally within teams and gaining buy-in. That's all part of that kind of sales behavior. And so to do that is really important at that key stage at the beginning to increase transparency about what that role actually includes and how you can look at those behaviors from the get-go, or even when people are promoted into those positions. Like always, instead of doing that just based on tenure and technical experience, we are looking at that overall picture of the individual's behaviors as well to help them progress through that.
Yeah, absolutely.